In the months before this pandemic, Canada-China relations were icy, at something of a standstill in the wake of the arrest here of a Huawei executive. Now, shipments of critical medical supplies arrive regularly, if not without a few glitches. With us now to trace the plot lines in our bilateral relationship with China and its shifting place in the world, we welcome, in Washington, D.C., Robert Delaney. He is the North America Bureau Chief for the South China Morning Post. And here in the downtown of our provincial capital, Lynette Ong, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, jointly appointed at the Asian Institute and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And we're delighted to welcome both of you onto TVO tonight for a timely conversation about a country that has been in the crosshairs of just about every other country in the world over the last 5 weeks since this pandemic hit. Robert, let's put you to work first. How would you have characterized Canada-Chinese relations prior to the COVID-19 outbreak?
Well, they had already been at a low point, Steve, basically because of the Huawei situation, which was then, of course, exacerbated by the detention of the two Canadians who are still obviously detained with very little information about their well-being. So it had already been on a steady downward trajectory before the pandemic hit. So now it's sort of at a level that's fairly uncharted in terms of the history of China-Canada relations.
Lynette, how would you answer that question?
So in addition to what Robert has just said, I would just add that before COVID, a lot of Canadians were concerned about two things happening in China. One is its human rights records, its human rights abuses of Xinjiang and other ethnic minorities and the activists out there. And the second concern is political interference into Canadian politics and some of the businesses going on here. But I think in the post-COVID war, what it has shown is that information control, the very decisions that Chinese leadership makes, has an implications not only on Chinese citizens, but on you and me and everyone else in this world. So I think that has a lot of implications for all countries' relationship with China, not just Canada-China relations.
Robert, I'm wondering if you consider, this pandemic is both a challenge and an opportunity, depending on how you look at it. And I wonder whether you see this pandemic as a potential opportunity to repair relations with China for Canada, or maybe for them to worsen. How do you see it going?
Well, it seems most obviously the shipments of medical equipment will present the opportunity because we're now the situation is still at its cresting, if you will. So the cooperation really has to continue for the time being. I think the question about whether or not things could worsen for the relationship just depends on what happens in the area of the Huawei situation and whether or not China will give Canada more of what it wants in terms of what's happening with the two Michaels who are detained in Canada.
Well,
so
the reality
there are
right now,
opportunities.
Lynette, is that nobody's talking about the two. Unfortunately, nobody is talking about the two Michaels, Lynette, and nobody's talking about Huawei right now either. All they're talking about is COVID-19. And to that extent, Lynette, I wonder whether this presents an opportunity for relations to get even worse, because there's a lot of Canadians pretty mad at China right now as the starting point of this virus. What do you think?
I think the stake for Canada right now is actually much higher than it was 3 months ago. 3 months ago, what was at stake is our telecommunications network, as well as the well-being of two Canadians being held in Beijing. But right now, the entire nation is at stake. Not only the entire nation, but the entire world. But I think, in a crisis situation, one would usually look to the US for leadership. And right now there's a hollowing out of leadership. And then China is stepping up, and China was the first to face the crisis. So they ramp up PPE production. Now it is the only country that PPE is actually in surplus. So everyone is looking to China for that supply, and that is largely, I think, a function of just the supply and demand. They are the only one which is producing it in surplus. But then there's also rightly so, a quality issue, concerns about some of the standards out there. And there has been pushback against the so-called China's face mask diplomacy. I think all that is actually very valid. But in some countries, that is actually gaining traction and gaining ground, particularly in developing countries in Southeast Asia.
And Lynette, let me follow up with you on a sort of developing political situation in our nation's capital, which is, because we have a minority parliament, the opposition parties sort of ganged up on the government and forced them to create this parliamentary committee, this Canada-China parliamentary committee. I guess a two-part question. What's the mission of this committee, and do you see anything substantial coming out of it?
Ideally, from my standpoint, what I would like to see coming out from this committee is to get a bunch of people from all walks of life to testify. Not only, the so-called China scholars, but people who have run business, who have lived in China, who have dealt with China in various dimensions. I think they would have interesting things to say and to contribute to public debate. And I think it is still at a rather beginning stage. I just have not seen that coming.
Robert, let me get you to follow up. Like what?
I'm sorry. So I guess I would say that having the parliamentary committee does make sense. It provides a broader plane, if you will, of viewpoints about how to deal with China. I can't help sort of being in Washington to compare to the way that Washington is approaching this, which is very much the policy towards China is being guided from one point. Really, it's just from the president, Donald Trump, and I think that often causes a lot of inconsistency. So with the parliamentary committee in Canada, I think it's important, so that it will create, because you'll have more viewpoints, more opinions going into how the relationship should be guided. It makes a lot more sense. I think it would create a lot more consistency in the way that in Canada's approach and coming up with formulating a more broad-based strategy in how Canada needs to deal with China going forward.
And Robert, as you look, let's just change our focus to the Chinese government itself for a moment. As you look at what's gone on over the past, 4 or 5 months in China, do you think the leadership there has learned anything from the way it's handled, not just the COVID situation, but let's go back, the avian flu, SARS, all of that? Have they learned anything?
Well, I think they've definitely learned something. Let's go back to 2002, 2003 with SARS. Now, what happened with SARS was that you had a period of up to 2 months where the government was not being forthright about what was happening. They were not being, they were trying to cover up the extent of the SARS outbreak and the spread of the disease in China. And it wasn't until sometime in early 2003 when they got rid of the health minister and replaced the health minister with a very capable bureaucrat. Her name was Wu Yi. And at that point, the government was very upfront about what was going on. They were providing much more accurate counts in terms of cases and deaths and whatnot. And so when you look at that situation, it took 2 months for the Chinese government to sort of get on board with the idea that they need to be completely transparent, that this was a real threat. Now, if you fast forward to the COVID situation, we know that there were missteps in the beginning. We know that the government knew more than it was letting on at the very beginning, and we're talking about a period of weeks. they did at the end of December, December 31st, I believe it was, they did notify the WHO office in Beijing of their awareness of the disease. They then provided, they sequenced the gene in I believe the first week of January. So I guess you could say that the difference is that the time period between the understanding of what was happening and ultimately the reporting about what was going on to the outside world was shortened significantly. Of course, the problem is that that period, even though it was shortened, was still sort of detrimental and had given the virus a chance to escape from China's borders.
Well, Lynette, I do have to ask whether or not those lessons from SARS 17 years ago really were learned this time. I mean, let's face it, the Chinese government's first instinct was to humiliate and ostracize the scientist in China who originally blew the whistle on this thing. And then they realized he was right, and then he died. So how much really did they learn from previous pandemics to be helpful this time around?
Yes and no. So after SARS, the government actually did put in place what is supposed to be a fail-proof system. So the system was in place, and then the fire alarm was sounded. I think some people would say, back in November or even December. But even after the fire alarm, the political leadership, regional political leadership in Hubei province, decided to ignore it because they had a big regional parliamentary session coming up at the time. And that being a very big function, celebratory, the government decided that, we should not jeopardize it because the virus, if it breaks out, it might actually destabilize the whole situation. So now and again, we see the prioritization of social stability and economic growth above everything else in China, right? So this is the very intrinsic characteristic of information control coming out from an autocracy. So if that doesn't change, they can put in place, very perfect system. The system is in place, but people making the decisions hasn't changed. Their mindset hasn't changed because the way in which they have been evaluated is very much, according to the common system.
Well, let's follow up with this, Lynette. That was the reaction in huge China. Let's now compare that to tiny Taiwan, which has been getting kudos pretty much all over the world for the way it has handled the pandemic. How would you compare the reaction in Taiwan?
Taiwan has done so much better in comparison, not only to China, but to a lot of countries, most of the countries out there. So right from the beginning, the Taiwan government nationalized mask supply in the country, brought it up so they could ration it to their citizens. And it also has quite equally distributed and access to all healthcare system, which has really helped to provide free healthcare to their own citizens. And they have got very good big data. They have made use of big data and surveillance technology to keep track of people coming in and then how people move around the country. But the unfortunate thing is, I think what Taiwan has learned is very lessons is actually it's not feedback into WHO because it is not part of WHO. So the lessons are actually lost.
Well, let me pick up on that with Robert. It is called the World Health Organization, and one of the countries in the world that has done the best at fighting this virus is Taiwan. And Taiwan is not a member of the WHO. Why not, Robert?
Well, Taiwan is not a member of the WHO. Simply, it's a result of diplomatic recognition that countries confer onto China, and so this is not only the case of the U.S. but obviously Canada also. So the WHO is an agency of the United Nations, and within the United Nations, the legitimate government of China is seen as being Beijing and not Taiwan. So it's purely a technicality, really, that or it's a technical aspect of the fact that China has a seat in the United Nations and Taiwan doesn't. So there's sort of no way around that, simply because the WHO is in fact an agency of the UN. The question is whether or not efforts could be made to bring back Taiwan and give Taiwan observer status within the WHO.
Well, Lynette, let's work on that premise. Given Taiwan's excellent performance during the course of all of this, do you think that gives it, does that lend credence to its view that it belongs in the WHO? And do you think there are other countries that may back that, given its performance during the COVID pandemic?
I think if international organizations want to be creative around it, in some organizations such as APEC, Taiwan has been admitted as Chinese Taipei, not a full country, but calling it Chinese Taipei. Actually allow what Taiwan has learned is experience in fighting SARS as well as in fighting COVID. That sort of lessons to be shared with everyone else. I think that would be very useful. So I think the onus is now on the rest of us, all the other countries in WHO, the members country, to push back against the leadership, insisting that a country that has done so excellent, has performed so well, should be admitted into the international organization, and now is the time to do so.
Robert, you're in Washington, D.C., so I should ask you this question. Donald Trump has said a lot of crazy things during the course of this pandemic, but one thing he said that seems to have a lot of support, and not just among his base, but beyond that, is the notion that the WHO is disproportionately adversely influenced by China. And as a result, he has, I think he's more than threatened. I think he's now pulling U.S. funding from the WHO until he can get some better answers as to China's influence there. Is he right about that?
Is he right about that? I mean, the thing is, there's no rights or wrongs in this discussion, but I would say that I think it's generally understood, and I think it's generally accepted that the WHO was very laudatory of how China was handling the situation as they were discussing the steps that China was taking. This is going back to January and February, before the pandemic before it became the pandemic. So there's a lot of scrutiny onto those statements that the WHO was making. In particular, praising the Chinese government's efforts, and at the same time advising against travel bans. And you have to look at the totality of these comments that the WHO was saying. And I think if you look at them all, it's a fair question to ask: was the WHO playing too much to the wishes of Beijing, and not enough, and not considering enough the danger and the threat that was being posed to other countries at the time?
Lynette, while we're talking about the American president, I should ask you, he has made it a point to not refer to the COVID-19 virus from time to time, but rather the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus. And he seems quite adamant about reminding people where this thing came from. There's some people who think that's completely appropriate. After all, MERS is Middle East respiratory syndrome, and there are Spanish flu. There's lots of these pandemics that have got a place in their name. But some people think that he's sort of playing fast and loose this way in order to drum up anti-Asian sentiment. Can I get you to weigh in on that? What do you think?
My understanding is he started calling it Chinese virus after a foreign diplomat in Beijing speculated that the virus came to China because of the U.S. Army. So right now, what we are seeing is this war. tug of war going on between Beijing and Washington D.C. And I think that is just not helpful in coming up with a solution to deal with these crises collectively. And the other implication of that is after President Trump calling it a Chinese virus, we see this rise of racist attacks against Asian Americans, not only Asian Americans, but we are also seeing racist attacks happening in countries such as Australia. So I think from that implication, I think this is, number one, it is not helping to come up with a solution. And number two, it is actually arousing people's irrational sentiment and blaming some people as scapegoats.
Can I just ask you a very personal question, Lynette, which is, have you ever during the course of this pandemic yourself, as a person of Asian background, felt uncomfortable or unsafe because of the way this pandemic is being referred to?
Yes. At the beginning, when this pandemic first happened, I was in the United States. I had face masks with me, but I was very reluctant to wear them because I knew that I would be attracting attention from what I have read from social media. But then as someone of Asian descent, I am also very very wary of the sort of very conflicting role out there. And I've got friends and networks in China and Asia, and my first instinct is that what is it that people like myself can actually do to help their situations. And I would say that a lot of Asians, Canadian and Asian Americans are actually in my position. I myself have been trying to see what I can do to help. Contacting my friends, contacting suppliers to see that we can do the help to relieve the shortage of PPE supplies here.
Understood. Robert, just finally, can I get a comment from you on what you think this means to the greater efforts of Xi Jinping's regime in China?
I think it means that they've got a big challenge ahead of themselves internationally on the diplomatic front. There's a lot of. I think that he's not going to lose his domestic support, because once the government started to act on this situation, they did manage to bring it under control very effectively. They're still fighting outbreaks here and there, but by and large, it is under control. So Xi Jinping's challenge at this point is really going to be how to deal with the international community, which is looking for answers and is in some cases looking for retribution. So while his domestic support is I think still solid, there's quite a threat on the horizon in terms of how he's going to manage the country's international relationships.
That's our time. My thanks to both of you, Robert Delaney from the South China Morning Post and Lynette Ong from the University of Toronto. It's good to have both of you on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.